Hey everybody, and welcome back to another video. Andrew Breitbart once famously pointed out, politics is downstream from culture. It's a simple yet profound and very true statement, and exactly why libertarians should care and be involved in discussions and attempts to influence culture. I hear a lot of people claim libertarians don't concern themselves with the culture war BS. Well, you should. Because whoever emerges as the dominant part of that culture at that time will eventually exercise rule over you to some degree. We can all dream of a perfect society free of state coercion and control where everyone is free to partake in a harmonious, laissez-faire, Austrian-style economy where all are unencumbered to pursue their aspirations and dreams without fear of others or the state causing them harm and hindering their dreams. But when you get your head out of the clouds and back into the real world, you need to recognize that A, that world does not currently exist, and B, will never exist if the extreme on either side comes out ahead. Like it or not, there is a culture war, and the prize is modern Western civilization. Partake or not, eventually it will affect you, and recognition of this is not an endorsement of it, however. Like any war, there eventually will emerge a victor. And typically in war, the most strong-willed, committed, and willing to persevere wins. And eventually one side will emerge victorious, or at least more dominant, as the culture war seems to ebb and flow, and change hands who is on top very frequently. Just look at the last few years. We went from being canceled for having an opinion and speaking out against the status quo to a shift in the opposite direction and a rejection of wokeness. Look at the political climate of the music industry for the best example. The aptly crafted caricature of fight the power giving way to the current idea of rage with the machine. We've gone from the 80s punk mentality of fighting the man to the recent how dare you question authority. And like a vicious, desperate predator, whichever side becomes the most desperate, the most vicious, the most tenacious, will inflict the most damage. We all don't want to be ruled over, but the reality of the world is that in our current state, as awful as it is, we are being ruled over to an extent. And the culture war is one of the main deciding factors of who does that ruling and how. Libertarians can try and claim they set this one out and, quote, don't get involved with the culture war BS.
How's that working out for you?
But in the end, someone will exercise control over you to an extent until we no longer live under that kind of system. Which would you rather? The extreme that polices your language and demands you conform to their ideology and structure of beliefs? Or the other extreme that polices your language and demands you conform to their ideology and structure of beliefs, but with a rainbow flag? Culture is what dictates societal norms, the prevailing winds of what is acceptable, and how we interact with others. The culture war gave us Black Lives Matter, the trans movement, and sadly the Israel's our greatest ally, and if you don't support them unconditionally, you're an anti-Semite. The culture war canceled Gina Carano for saying her pronouns were beep boop. The culture war gave us Dylan Mulvaney and the fall from the top that Bud Light's brand suffered. The culture war is what feeds the WNBA madness, as well as the demand for answers on Epstein. Culture influences politics. It's what led to the Trump revolution, and alternatively, got AOC elected. The culture demanded parents be labeled domestic terrorists for wanting to have a say in their children's schools' policies. Denial is not just a river in Egypt. You can claim that cultural BS doesn't matter, but it is a driving influence on many things in our society. Failure to recognize or even partake in some cultural aspects can result in ostracization, cancellation, and your livelihood being destroyed. They tried to cancel Joe Rogan, and thankfully they failed. But the attempt was still made, all because he went against, quote, the current thing, trademark. It may seem silly, but there's nothing funny when you stand against the push to force people to go along with delusions and suddenly find yourself facing an onslaught of hate, labels of being a bigot, and threats of being doxxed, fined, fired, or worse. Look no further than the United Kingdom. That is the extreme example of the culture war gone mad, where people are literally thrown in jail over social media posts because they offended somebody. And of course, that whole offended is extremely subjective. Which brings me to my final point. When people say live and let live, and what someone does with their own body is not of my concern, is an oversimplification of what's really happening. Yes, my beliefs, my principles, they dictate that what someone does with their own body is their business and nobody else's. However, in the overall social morality of things, I am allowed an opinion. And it has been to no benefit of the libertarians in adopting this idea that we are the ideology that welcomes both the preacher and the pornographer. Moral ambiguity is not a virtuous or noble trait to adopt, and claiming neutrality on the culture conflict will not work out in our favor. The preacher may have ulterior motives to push his religious ideology on everyone, and the pornographer may very well advocate for his product to be allowable in public spaces and or consumed by minors. It may sound absurd and extreme, but it has happened and has been happening. Look at our schools. Failure to have guardrails in cultural topics can very well lead to disaster, even if one wants to stand firm in the libertarian principle of leave others alone. At some point, the others may cease to respect those boundaries and begin to force their view and their will on others. Just look at one of the most controversial aspects of the current culture war. The ideology that one can change their gender at will simply by identifying as that. It's fine. If someone wants to identify as something, great, but I don't have to accept it as factual reality. And everything is fine so long as we are allowed to agree to disagree. But in reality, agree to disagree is long dead and has shifted to accept our existence or expect our resistance. Tolerance and acceptance doesn't necessarily mean unilateral and unconditional agreement. They want to engage in violence against those who do not want to play along with their fantasy. And that is where the culture war risks becoming an actual war. That is why we should care. That is why we should not be spectators on the sidelines, watching while the extremes duke it out. You may not want to participate, but eventually you will be affected by the results. There is a real possibility of periphery being damaged. The collateral damage that could occur could affect you. Deny its importance at your own peril, because you may not think that the culture war is consequential, until it's you who is facing down the consequences of one side or the other gaining enough power to impact your life. Face the wall, Rube. You may not believe in the culture war, but
you're in one.